The wind was quiet that morning, almost too quiet for a world that had been torn apart by war. The sky hung low, covered in a pale gray that looked like old paper. On a narrow dirt road, lined with broken branches and forgotten helmets, a group of exhausted Japanese soldiers walked slowly toward the horizon. Their uniforms were worn, their faces empty, their steps heavy. They had survived battles, hunger, fear, and long marches. But now they were walking into something they feared even more: captivity. For many of them, this moment felt like the end of life itself. They had been told all their lives that the enemy was cruel, that to surrender was shameful, and that American soldiers would treat them with harshness the moment they were captured. Their minds were filled with terrifying images, shaped by years of stories, warnings, and propaganda. Surrender was not bravery. It was disgrace. And the punishment for disgrace, they believed, would be severe. As the road curved, the first sight of the American camp appeared through the fog. Tall wooden fences, guard towers, barbed wire at the top. It looked cold and closed, almost like a shadow sitting on the land. The soldiers stopped for a moment. Some swallowed hard. Some closed their eyes. Some whispered quiet prayers to themselves. They did not know what waited for them on the other side of those gates. When the American guards approached, the Japanese soldiers braced themselves. They expected shouting. They expected anger. They expected rough hands that would drag them into the camp. But what they saw instead surprised them. The guards were calm. Their faces serious but not hateful. Their voices firm but not cruel. They offered water. They pointed the way. They spoke slowly so the prisoners could understand their gestures. There was no threat in their eyes. Only duty. And something else, something the prisoners had not expected at all, a quiet sense of respect. It felt strange. Almost impossible. A few prisoners kept their heads lowered, waiting for something bad to happen. But nothing did. The guards checked them for injuries and guided them forward with steady, patient movements. Some prisoners blinked in confusion. Others exchanged unsure glances. They had been prepared for harshness. Instead, the first feeling they received was simple human kindness. Perhaps this was where it truly began, the slow breaking of a wall built by years of fear. As they walked through the entrance, the camp opened in front of them. Barracks lined up in neat rows, fields of open ground, watchtowers spaced far apart, and small buildings at the center where food and supplies were kept. It didn't look like a place built for cruelty. It looked like a place built for order. And maybe even fairness. The air smelled of wood, smoke, and freshly cooked food drifting from the kitchen block. The sun, now breaking through the clouds, warmed the ground. A light breeze carried the voices of American soldiers speaking among themselves. Even though the prisoners didn't understand the words, the tone was normal. Not hateful. Not angry. Still, the fear did not leave their hearts right away. It stayed, like a shadow behind them, reminding them of everything they had been taught. They were still prisoners. They were still on enemy soil. And they still did not know what the days ahead would bring. Inside the barracks, they found clean floors, simple beds, and blankets folded neatly at the corners. This surprised many of them. They had expected dark rooms, dirt floors, or harsh conditions. Instead, what they saw felt almost like a military dormitory. Hard, yes. Strict, yes. But not cruel. A warm bowl of soup was placed in their hands. Bread on the side. A little fruit. The smell rose gently into the air. One soldier held the bowl in both hands and stared at it, his eyes shaking. He had been hungry for days. But more than that, he had never expected to receive something like this from the enemy. He had never imagined that his first meal in captivity would come with simple dignity. Slowly the men began to eat. Quietly. Carefully. Some of them cried softly, though they hid their faces. Not because the food was extraordinary, but because the moment felt unreal, almost like a dream they should not trust. Still, it was real. And it was the beginning of a truth they would soon learn again and again, that things inside these camps would not match the darkness they had feared. The next morning, sunlight poured over the camp in thin golden lines. The faint crow of a rooster echoed in the distance. The prisoners woke to a bell that signaled the start of the day. They lined up outside, guided by guards who stood calmly nearby. No shouting. No angry orders. Just routine. Daily life began to reveal itself. The Americans had strict rules, but the rules were clear and consistent. There was work to do: cleaning, helping in the kitchen, repairing fences, growing vegetables in the small camp garden. But the work was manageable. And the guards treated them like men, not like enemies from a story. Slowly, trust, fragile and thin like paper, began to grow. One day, a Japanese soldier hurt his foot on a loose nail. He tried to hide it, afraid it would make him look weak or cause trouble. But a guard noticed him limping and called for a medic. The medic arrived, knelt down, cleaned the wound, and wrapped it in bandages. It was a small act, a simple task. But to the prisoner, it felt like a beam of light breaking through a thick wall of darkness. He realized something he had never thought possible: the enemy cared if he was hurt. Another day, an American guard placed a small radio on a table near the kitchen. Soft music flowed out, something calm with slow rhythms and gentle notes. The prisoners paused, listening. They didn't know the song, but the melody touched them. For a moment, the world did not feel like war. It felt like something human, something peaceful. They began to see the guards not as monsters but as people. Young, tired, far from home, doing their duty. And the guards began to see the prisoners not as faceless enemies, but as men trying to survive something much bigger than themselves. Over the weeks, conversations began, not in full sentences but in gestures, simple words and smiles. A guard might point to the sky and say rain, teaching the English word. A prisoner might respond with the Japanese word, creating a tiny bridge of understanding. Those small exchanges grew slowly, like seeds planted in difficult soil. Some prisoners wrote letters home for the first time in months. The Americans provided paper, ink, and stamps. Many of the men cried while writing. Not only because they could send a message to their families, but because they realized something important: they were being treated with fairness, even during a terrible war. Work days continued. Meals were served on time. Sick prisoners received medicine. And slowly, the fear that had filled their hearts began to fade. It didn't disappear completely, the memory of the war was still heavy. But it lessened, like a storm breaking apart in the distance. Still, inside the camp, conflict existed. Not with the guards, but within the prisoners themselves. Some felt guilt for accepting kindness from the enemy. Some worried what their families or fellow soldiers would think. Some believed that trusting the Americans was a betrayal of their identity. This inner struggle created tension among them. A few held tightly to old beliefs. Others felt their worldviews slowly changing. For the first time, they questioned what they had been taught. They wondered if the stories they grew up with had been incomplete or even wrong. And this question, simple yet powerful, began to echo through the minds of many. If the enemy was not who I thought they were, then what else have I misunderstood? Sometimes at night, the camp grew quiet except for the sound of crickets. The stars shone bright above the wooden roofs of the barracks. Some prisoners sat outside looking up at the sky. The same sky that stretched over Japan. The same sky that stretched over America. For the first time they felt something strange. Something peaceful. Something like hope. They started to realize that inside these fences, they were learning something unexpected about humanity. They were discovering that kindness could come from places they had never imagined. That respect could grow even between those who once stood on opposite sides of a battlefield. And that the world was far more complicated, and far more beautiful, than the stories of war had ever told them. Perhaps the real battle was not between nations, but between fear and understanding. And the first signs of understanding had begun to shine. Morning settled gently over the camp, stretching soft light across the rooftops as if the world itself wished to calm the hearts of those who lived inside the wooden fences. Birds sang from the nearby trees, their voices cutting through the silence with a surprising sweetness, almost like a reminder that life still existed outside the war. The prisoners stepped out of their barracks slowly, some rubbing their eyes, some stretching their tired arms, some simply standing for a moment to breathe the cool morning air. For many of them, this daily morning routine still felt unreal. They had expected fear to follow them every hour. They had expected rough treatment, cold orders, and harsh punishment. But instead, they woke to something they had not expected at all. A rhythm of life that felt steady, predictable, even safe. The smell of breakfast drifted through the air, warm oats, bread, a simple piece of fruit. 4 men who had marched for days on empty stomachs before their capture. Such meals felt almost like a gift. And yet, it wasn't the food alone that surprised them. It was the manner in which it was given. Calmly. Fairly. Without shouting. Without anger. Without treating them like less than human. As they stood in line, the American cook behind the counter nodded at each prisoner as he handed over the tray. He didn't know their language, but he understood something deeper, that a small gesture of respect could travel across any border. A nod, a simple smile, a moment of eye contact. These things mattered. They created quiet bridges where words could not. Some prisoners accepted the food with shaky hands. Some still avoided eye contact, unsure if kindness was real or temporary. But others, slowly, began to look back at the guards and the cooks with a bit of trust. A soft seed of understanding began to grow, tiny but alive. Outside the dining hall, men sat in small groups eating quietly. The soft clinking of metal spoons echoed softly. The air smelled of warm breakfast and the faint scent of pine trees from the forest nearby. The world felt calmer than it had in years. One older prisoner, a former teacher from Osaka, looked around the camp while holding his cup of warm tea. He had lived through the rise of nationalism, through the strict discipline of the Imperial Army, through battles filled with dust and fire. He had expected his final days to be spent under harsh treatment after his surrender. But what he saw around him confused him deeply: fairness, order, and even small acts of kindness. He whispered to the young man sitting beside him, "The world is more complicated than we were taught." The young man didn't reply, but the thought stayed in his mind. After breakfast, the day's tasks began. The prisoners were divided into work groups. Some cleaned the grounds. Others helped in the gardens where vegetables grew in neat rows. A few helped repair fences or roofs. Work was required, but it was not forced with cruelty. It was organized, clear, and manageable. The guards watched, but they did not treat the prisoners like slaves or enemies. They treated them like men performing their duty. The garden group became one of the most peaceful areas of the camp. The earth was soft. The air carried the fresh smell of soil and leaves. As prisoners planted seeds or watered rows of green beans, the world around them felt almost normal, almost like life before the war. Some of them remembered their own gardens back home. Memories of children running through small yards. Memories of parents bending over rice fields. Memories of quiet evenings with the scent of rain drifting across their villages. These memories mixed with the quiet work in the American camp. And for a few moments each day, the prisoners could breathe without the weight of fear. One afternoon, while watering the plants, a prisoner noticed an American guard watching them with curiosity. The guard stepped closer, pointed to a plant, and tried to pronounce the Japanese word for it. His pronunciation was terrible. The prisoners laughed softly. Not in mockery but in surprise. The guard laughed too, shaking his head. Then he repeated the word again, slower, trying to get it right. The prisoners helped him. And for a moment the war felt far away. This simple interaction wasn't just a friendly moment. It was something deeper. The realization that understanding could grow between people who had once seen each other as nothing more than enemies. As days passed, the camp routines created a new kind of world. A world where fear slowly faded, replaced by cautious trust. A world where small gestures mattered more than old propaganda. A world where men who once fought each other now shared small pieces of their cultures, their languages, and their humanity. But this new world did not come without internal conflict. Inside their hearts, many prisoners felt torn. They didn't know how to understand the kindness they were receiving. They had grown up hearing that Americans were violent, cruel, filled with hatred. And now, these same Americans were giving them food, medicine, and respect. This created a deep emotional struggle. Part of them wanted to accept the truth they saw with their own eyes. Another part wanted to hold on to the beliefs they had been raised with. Some nights, quiet arguments broke out inside the barracks. Older soldiers felt ashamed to accept help from the enemy. Younger soldiers felt relieved to be safe. The two sides often clashed, not with violence but with words. Fear, pride, guilt, all of these emotions filled the rooms. One soldier snapped at another, "How can you smile at the guards? Don't forget who they are." The other replied softly, "I don't forget. But they don't treat us like enemies." The first soldier looked away, struggling with thoughts he had never allowed himself to question. The internal battle inside the prisoners' hearts became one of the deepest parts of their experience. They were fighting themselves as much as the war itself. Yet day by day, small acts of humanity continued to break down the walls they carried within. One morning, a large storm rolled over the camp. The rain came down in sheets, pounding the roofs and filling the air with the smell of wet earth. Lightning cracked in the sky. Thunder rolled like distant drums. The prisoners, many of whom had marched long distances in storms during the war, expected the guards to ignore their struggles. But instead, the American guards hurried to help anyone who needed shelter. They guided older prisoners inside. They handed out dry blankets. One guard even helped close a window in the barracks where the rain was pouring in. He did it quickly, without hesitation, as if helping were the most natural thing in the world. A prisoner watching this felt something shift inside him. He whispered to himself, "The enemy protects us." The thought felt strange, but true. When the storm finally passed, the prisoners stepped outside. The sun broke through the clouds slowly, spreading golden light across puddles on the ground. The air smelled fresh, clean, and new. One of the guards smiled at them and said something cheerful in English, and even though they didn't understand the words, they understood the tone. Sometimes it was the tone that mattered most. Over time, some prisoners began teaching themselves small phrases in English. They picked up words from signs, from gestures, from the guards' conversations. They practiced quietly with each other, repeating simple words like, "Thank you," "water," or "good morning." A few American guards noticed this and tried to help, using hand signals or drawing pictures in the dirt. These small language exchanges became moments of connection that cut through the silence between them. The guards, too, grew curious about the prisoners. They saw that many of them were farmers, teachers, fishermen, not monsters, not bloodthirsty warriors, but ordinary men who had been swept into a war far beyond their control. This realization softened the hearts of many guards. They began to treat the prisoners with even more respect, not because they were ordered to, but because they wanted to. One guard, barely 20 years old, brought a prisoner a pencil and notebook after learning that the man liked to write. The prisoner accepted it with shaking hands. That night, he wrote his first poem in months, a gentle reflection about the sound of rain and the surprise of kindness in a place he had feared. Another prisoner, who knew a little English from school, started helping translate simple words for others. He became a quiet bridge between two worlds. Guards asked him for Japanese words. Prisoners asked him for English ones. He felt a new sense of purpose, something he had not felt since the war began. But the most emotional moments came from letters. Every few weeks, the prisoners were allowed to write home. For some, it was the first time in months that they could reach their families. They wrote slowly, tears falling onto the paper, telling their loved ones that they were alive, that they were safe, and, something many struggled to admit, that they were being treated with surprising fairness. These letters carried hope across oceans. Families in Japan, reading their sons' handwriting, must have felt a similar wave of relief. They must have imagined the camp, the guards, the daily routines. They must have wondered how such kindness could exist in a time of war. Inside the camp, changes continued. Work assignments grew smoother. Guards grew more familiar. The prisoners began to relax their rigid posture. They talked more openly. They shared stories from their villages, their childhoods, their families. They remembered things they had forgotten during the long years of fighting: laughter, music, warmth. Sometimes in the late afternoons when the sun dipped low, the guards allowed the prisoners to play simple games, baseball, volleyball, or even board games inside the barracks. At first, the prisoners were shy. But soon they grew more comfortable, chasing balls across the yard, laughing when someone stumbled, encouraging each other in quiet voices. The guards watched and occasionally joined in. Even though language separated them, the laughter brought them closer. It didn't erase the war. It didn't erase the losses. But it reminded them that they were all human. And sometimes reminding is enough. One winter morning, frost covered the ground like a thin layer of glass. The prisoners breathed out clouds of white air. The guards handed them extra blankets and warm jackets. These jackets were old, worn military coats that had been used by American soldiers earlier in the war. But inside the cold morning they felt precious. As the prisoners pulled the jackets around their shoulders, one of them whispered, "They want us to live." Another replied, "Yes, maybe they do." Even that simple recognition held great weight. Life inside the camp continued in this slow but meaningful rhythm. More truth was revealed in small moments. The way a guard carried water to a sick prisoner, the way a cook added an extra slice of bread when he knew someone was hungry, the way the Americans followed rules that protected the rights of prisoners. The prisoners began to see that these rules were not just words on paper. They were real. They were being followed. And because of that, lives were being changed. The quiet transformation happening inside the camp grew stronger each day. Fear softened. Understanding grew roots. Hope returned in small steps. Yet beneath all this, one question remained. If the enemy was capable of kindness, then what did that say about the world they had known before? This question would become the heart of their journey, a journey not just of survival but of rediscovery. A journey that would shape the rest of their lives. Winter melted slowly into spring, and the camp began to change with the season. Small green shoots pushed through the cold soil. Trees that had stood bare through the winter slowly grew new leaves. The air warmed, carrying the scent of wet earth and soft grass. Inside the camp, life continued with its steady rhythm, but something deeper was happening. Something that could not be seen, only felt. It was the slow rebuilding of trust. The Japanese prisoners who had once walked into the camp filled with fear and silence, had begun to open up. Not entirely, not completely, there were still moments of doubt, still heavy thoughts at night, still memories of the war that would not go away. But step by step their hearts were changing. One prisoner, a young man named Taro, felt the change more strongly than most. He had joined the army at 18, barely old enough to understand the world. He had grown up listening to stories that painted the Americans as brutal, cold-hearted, and endlessly cruel. When he was captured, he expected his life to be over. But now, months later, he found himself waking up each day with less fear and more curiosity. One morning, while helping in the camp garden, Taro noticed an American soldier kneeling beside a small patch of flowers near the fence. The soldier was carefully trimming the plants, humming softly to himself. The tune was gentle and warm, drifting into the air like a small breeze. Taro paused. He had never imagined that a soldier, an enemy soldier, would care for something as delicate as flowers. For a moment he simply watched. The soldier looked up, noticed him, and gave a quiet nod. Taro bowed his head slightly in return. The moment passed quickly. But something about it stayed with him long after. Later that day, Taro shared the story with a few other prisoners. Some listened with interest. Others shrugged and said that soldiers were soldiers no matter the nation. But one old man smiled and said, "Even in war, people still carry pieces of peace inside them." Those words echoed in Taro's mind. Pieces of peace. Maybe that was true. The Americans in the camp often showed small glimpses of this peace. Sometimes it appeared in the way they offered water to older prisoners before anyone else. Sometimes it appeared in the way they let the prisoners rest when the sun grew too hot. Sometimes it appeared in their friendly jokes with each other, or in the way they played music during their breaks. These moments helped the prisoners feel something they had not felt in a very long time: normalcy. Still, the path to understanding was not always smooth. Inside the barracks, conversations sometimes became heated. A few prisoners could not accept the idea of trusting the enemy. They felt shame every time a guard treated them with kindness. They felt guilty for accepting food, medicine, or basic respect. They believed that to trust the Americans was to betray their homeland. One night, a tense argument broke out. The men whispered fiercely, nervous that the guards might hear them. The topic was simple yet heavy: should they accept the kindness offered to them? A young prisoner said softly, "They treat us well. Better than we expected. Better than we deserve." An older man replied sharply, "Do not forget who they are. Do not forget what they have done." The young man looked down, torn. "But what I see here, it is different from what I was told." Silence filled the barracks after that. No one knew how to respond. It was a difficult truth. Kindness challenged everything they believed about war. And perhaps that was the point. A few days later, a new group of prisoners arrived. They looked frightened, exhausted, and suspicious. Their eyes darted around the camp, expecting danger at every corner. The older prisoners watched them closely, remembering their own first days. The guards guided the newcomers to the barracks with patience, offering them water and food. Taro observed the scene quietly. He remembered his own trembling hands. He remembered the tightness in his chest. Now, months later, he felt a sense of calm that he wished he could pass on to the newcomers. That evening, he approached one of them, a thin young man who sat alone on his bunk. Taro offered him a piece of fruit from his meal. The man hesitated, unsure if he should accept. But then he took it, bowing his head softly. In that moment, Taro realized something important. Kindness creates a chain. One act leads to another. Understanding grows not all at once, but through many small steps. As spring turned into summer, the camp became warmer and livelier. The prisoners grew used to the routines. They worked in the kitchen, cleaned the grounds, learned basic English, and even taught the guards some Japanese words. One American guard, named Miller, became especially curious about their language. He carried a small notebook where he tried to write down every Japanese word he learned. Sometimes his spelling was wrong. Sometimes his pronunciation made the prisoners laugh. But he never became angry. He laughed with them. One day he pointed at himself and said slowly, "Miare." The prisoners nodded and repeated, "Miller." Then he pointed at one of the prisoners and tried to say his name. His attempt was so awkward that the prisoner burst out laughing before quickly covering his mouth in embarrassment. Instead of being offended, the guard laughed too. Soon the whole group was smiling. Moments like this slowly reshaped the atmosphere of the camp. The guards and prisoners were still on opposite sides. The fences still stood. The war still existed outside. But inside the camp, something gentle and unexpected grew: understanding. Not friendship. Not trust without caution. But understanding. One afternoon, the prisoners were allowed to take part in a simple baseball game organized by the Americans. Baseball was already popular in Japan before the war, and many prisoners understood the rules. The game began softly, with hesitant throws and gentle swings. But soon the energy grew. Laughter echoed across the field. Dust rose under running feet. Cheers broke out when someone hit the ball far across the yard. For a brief moment, no one saw the fences. No one saw the uniforms. No one saw the enemy. They saw men. Just men. After the game, the prisoners sat on the grass, catching their breath. The warm sun touched their faces. A guard offered them cool water. They drank slowly, peacefully. It felt like a simple human moment, something they had not felt in years. That night, Taro lay on his bunk, staring at the wooden ceiling. He thought about the baseball game. He thought about Miller's notebook. He thought about the guard trimming flowers. He thought about the letters they sent home. He thought about the warmth of the sun and the sound of laughter. Quietly, he whispered to himself, "The world is not so small." Meanwhile, another prisoner, a former fisherman named Kenji, began helping the American medics. He had steady hands and gentle eyes, and though he could not speak English well, the medics noticed his calm nature. They let him assist with simple tasks: organizing supplies, handing bandages, fetching water. Kenji had seen many difficult things during the war. He had seen pain, sickness, and loss. Now in the camp he saw the opposite: healing. He watched the American medics treat prisoners with care and patience. He saw them kneel beside injured men, checking their pulses, cleaning wounds, and offering encouraging smiles. Kenji had expected the enemy to ignore their suffering. But here he saw them doing the opposite. One day, after helping wrap a bandage around a prisoner's arm, Kenji paused and touched the clean cloth gently. The medic beside him nodded, acknowledging his good work. Kenji felt a lump rise in his throat. He bowed his head slightly. The medic placed a hand on his shoulder, a simple gesture but a meaningful one. A few feet away, another prisoner watched the scene unfold. He wondered how it was possible that two men from opposite sides of the world, once ready to harm each other, now worked together in silence, united by the simple goal of easing someone's pain. Summer continued, bringing warm evenings and soft winds. The prisoners often sat outside after dinner, watching the sun sink behind the distant hills. The sky would glow in shades of orange and purple, painting the camp in gentle colors. In those moments, a peaceful hush filled the air. Some prisoners used the quiet time to write in notebooks or carve small wooden figures. Others drew pictures of their homes, their families, or the landscapes they missed. A few simply closed their eyes and enjoyed the rare feeling of safety. Taro often joined Kenji and a few others near the fence. They talked softly about their families, their dreams, and the things they planned to do once the war was over. Sometimes they spoke of fear of judgment, fear of what waited back home, fear of how their surrender would be understood. But they also spoke of hope. Little by little, hope returned to their hearts. Even the guards began to notice the change. They saw that the prisoners were calmer, more cooperative, more at peace. The guards themselves also changed. They no longer saw the prisoners as distant figures from strange lands. They saw them as people with stories, families, and struggles. One guard told another, "They're more like us than we thought." And he was right. In early summer, the camp received news that the war in Europe had ended. The guards celebrated quietly, relieved but respectful of the prisoners' own emotions. The prisoners watched the celebration from a distance. They did not fully understand what the end of that part of the war meant for them, but they saw something important: joy without cruelty. The guards did not use their happiness to mock the prisoners. They did not gloat or celebrate at the prisoners' expense. They simply shared the moment among themselves. It was another sign, another piece of evidence, that the Americans were not the monsters the prisoners had been taught to fear. As more news arrived about the global war, the air inside the camp shifted again. Some prisoners felt hopeful, sensing that peace might come soon. Others felt nervous, wondering what the end of the war would mean for them. But everyone felt the same quiet tension, the feeling that the world was about to change again. One evening, as the sun disappeared and shadows stretched across the yard, Taro sat with Kenji at the edge of the barrack steps. The air smelled of warm grass and distant smoke from the kitchen. Fireflies blinked softly in the fields beyond the fence. Taro said quietly, "I wonder how people will see us when we go home." Kenji looked up at the sky. "I don't know. But I hope they believe us when we say we were treated well." Taro nodded. "I hope so too." The truth they had learned inside the camp, that humanity could exist even in war, was something they wanted to carry home. Something they wanted to share. Something they hoped others would understand. But they knew it would not be easy. As night settled, the camp lights flickered on, casting soft glows across the yard. The prisoners returned to their barracks, lying on their bunks and closing their eyes. For the first time in many months, many of them slept without fear. Outside, the guards walked their rounds quietly. The world was still at war. But inside these fences, something had changed. A small space of peace had grown, a space built not by treaties or politics, but by small acts of humanity. Perhaps the prisoners began to think, this was the lesson they were meant to learn. Not that war was simple, but that people were more complicated than stories. Not that enemies were always enemies, but that kindness could appear in unexpected places. Not that fear ruled everything, but that courage sometimes meant opening your heart to the truth. It was still too early to fully understand it all. But deep inside they knew, their time in the camp was changing them. And someday before long the world outside would change as well. Late summer arrived with heavy air and long warm evenings. The camp glowed gold at sunset, and even the fences seemed softer in the light. The prisoners went about their routines as usual, but something felt different in the air, an invisible restlessness, like the world was holding its breath. Rumors had begun to spread. Soft whispers moved through the barracks at night. Words carried from guard to guard, even though they tried to keep their conversations quiet. Something big was happening beyond the walls of the camp. The prisoners did not know exactly what it was. But they felt it. They sensed it. Then one afternoon the news came: Japan had surrendered. The war, the long, painful war that had taken years from millions of lives, was over. Silence filled the camp at first, thick and heavy. Some prisoners stood completely still, unsure how to react. Others stared at the ground, their hearts pulled in different directions. A few sank to their knees, overwhelmed by emotions too large to name. The American guards did not shout, celebrate, or wave flags inside the camp. They respected the moment. They understood what the news meant to the prisoners. For the guards, it meant victory. For the prisoners, it meant something far more complicated. Relief mixed with shame, hope mixed with sorrow, peace mixed with fear of what waited at home. Taro felt the world tilt beneath him. He closed his eyes, feeling a rush of emotions he could not control. Memories of friends lost, battles fought, dreams broken, all returned at once. But there was also something else. The quiet belief that maybe, just maybe, life could begin again. Kenji stood near the garden, staring at the green leaves he had helped grow. He touched them gently as if grounding himself. He whispered, "It is over, again and again, trying to make the words real. Later that evening, the camp gathered in the yard. An American officer stepped forward, his expression calm and respectful. Through a translator, he explained that the war had ended and that soon, arrangements would be made for the prisoners to return home. A wave of emotion moved across the crowd. Some prisoners felt relief so strong it made their hands tremble. Others felt dread, wondering who was left waiting for them. Some wondered whether they would be judged harshly for surrendering. Some wondered whether their homes still stood. But beneath all those fears, something else rose to the surface. The knowledge that they had survived. The officer ended his announcement with a simple sentence, "You will be going home." For months, the prisoners had lived in uncertainty. Now the future suddenly felt bright and confusing and hopeful all at once. That night, the camp felt different. The guards walked their rounds with quieter steps. The prisoners spoke softly, sharing dreams of their families, their villages, their futures. Hope returned to their eyes, bright, fragile, trembling like a small flame in the wind. Over the next few weeks, preparations for release began. The Americans organized documents, checked names, provided clothing, and ensured that each prisoner was healthy enough to travel. The medics worked long hours, giving checkups, medicine, and advice. One morning, Kenji was called into the medical tent. The American medic he had helped for so long examined him carefully. When he finished, he smiled and said slowly, "Good. Strong." Kenji understood the words even though they were simple. He bowed deeply in gratitude. Miller, the guard with the notebook, also prepared for the prisoner's departure. He seemed quieter than usual, as if the idea of the camp emptying made him reflective. One afternoon, he approached Taro with his notebook open. On one page, he had written several Japanese phrases, carefully copied with uneven handwriting. Taro smiled. "You learned many words," he said softly. Miller grinned and pointed to a line where he had written, "friends." The word was misspelled, but Taro understood. He placed a hand over his heart and nodded. Miller did the same. It was a small moment, but it carried the weight of everything they had lived through together. As the days passed, the camp changed. The tension that once filled every corner had vanished. In its place, there was a quiet sense of gratitude. Gratitude from the prisoners for the kindness they had been shown, and gratitude from the guards for the cooperation and respect they received. Finally, the day arrived. The prisoners stood in lines near the entrance of the camp, the same entrance they had walked through months ago with fear in their hearts. Now they stood taller, calmer. The guards stood across from them, hands behind their backs, watching with expressions that were proud yet gentle. Each prisoner received a small slip of paper, some basic supplies, and a simple meal for the journey. Many also received something more personal, a handshake from a guard, a nod of respect, a quiet "good luck." Taro approached the gate slowly. Miller stood waiting. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Miller extended his hand. Taro took it. Their handshake was firm, strong, filled with silent meaning. In that single moment, the distance between two worlds closed. Nearby, Kenji bowed deeply to the medics he had worked with. One of them stepped forward and returned the bow, awkwardly but sincerely. Other prisoners said their quiet goodbyes. Some touched the wooden fence gently as they passed, remembering the days they had lived behind it. Some looked up at the sky, feeling the sun on their faces in a way that felt new and full of promise. And then, step by step, they walked out of the camp. A long dirt road stretched ahead, leading toward a future none of them fully understood. But they walked with steady steps, carrying not just their belongings, but also the lessons they had learned inside the camp. After a long journey across land and sea, they finally returned to Japan. Their homecoming was emotional and complicated. Some families greeted them with tears of joy. Others looked at them with confusion or sorrow. Some wondered why they had surrendered. Some were simply relieved to have them alive. Taro returned to his village on a cool autumn afternoon. His mother, who had feared he was gone forever, held him tightly, crying into his shoulder. He closed his eyes, letting the moment wash over him. For the first time in years he felt truly home. Kenji returned to his small fishing town by the sea. His father, an old fisherman with weathered hands, embraced him without a word. They stood there for a long time listening to the waves crash against the shore. But not all moments were easy. Some villagers whispered behind their backs. Some questioned their survival. Some did not understand how men could return from enemy camps without bitterness. The prisoners tried to explain. They spoke of fairness. They spoke of order. They spoke of the surprising humanity they experienced. But not everyone wanted to believe it. The wounds of war were still fresh. Still, over time, the truth found its place. Years passed. The world changed. New alliances formed. Old tensions softened. Japan rebuilt itself from ashes, rising with strength and determination. And through it all, the memories of the camp stayed alive in the hearts of those who had lived there. Taro became a teacher. He often looked at his students and thought about the lessons he had learned, that kindness mattered, that understanding mattered, that humanity existed even in the hardest places. Sometimes he told his students stories about his time in the camp. Not stories of war, but stories of small moments. A guard handing him a blanket, a medic treating a cut, a game of baseball on a warm afternoon. Kenji returned to fishing but kept a small box of keepsakes from his time in the camp. The simple medical bandage wrapper he had saved, a smooth stone from the camp garden, and a small paper with English words written by the medics. Sometimes he looked at these things and smiled softly. Other former prisoners found different paths. Some became farmers again. Some opened shops. Some became writers or historians. Many wrote about their experiences, telling the world about the unexpected kindness they had received. Their words helped bridge the distance between countries. They helped heal wounds. They helped create understanding in a world that desperately needed it. The guards, too, carried memories. Miller kept his notebook. The medics remembered the soft-spoken fishermen who helped them. They told their families stories that softened the idea of the enemy, reminding their children that war did not define the heart of a person. Over the decades, former prisoners and former guards reunited. Some traveled across oceans to meet again. They shook hands. They hugged. They cried. They remembered the days in the camp, the hard days, the surprising days, the days where humanity shone brighter than fear. One such reunion happened many years later. Taro, now an older man, stood in a peaceful garden in California. He was nervous but excited. Miller approached slowly, gray-haired, still carrying the same soft smile. When they finally reached each other, they bowed and then embraced, both laughing gently at how much time had passed. Miller pulled out something from his pocket, the old notebook. Taro ran his fingers over the worn cover and felt a deep warmth in his heart. They sat together for hours, sharing memories, filling the silence with stories that had waited a lifetime to be spoken. In the end, the story of the POW camps was not a story about suffering. It was not a story about violence. It was not even a story about victory or defeat. It was a story about humanity. A story about how kindness could break walls built by fear. A story about how respect could grow between people who once saw each other as enemies. A story about how, even in war, the human heart could choose compassion. And perhaps that is the greatest truth of all, that in the darkest chapters of history, the brightest lights often come from simple acts of humanity. Because humanity, once given, never disappears. It stays. It grows. It echoes across time. And for the prisoners who entered the U.S. camps expecting brutality but found kindness instead, that kindness changed everything. It shaped their futures. It softened their memories of war. It taught them that understanding is stronger than fear. It taught them that even in conflict, people can choose peace. And today their story reminds us of something important, something the world can never afford to forget. That even in the hardest times, kindness matters. Understanding matters. Humanity matters. And sometimes, in the most unexpected places, humanity is exactly what saves us.